The morning sun was already high above the small town of Willow Creek, casting golden rays through the wide glass windows of the First National Bank. Inside, the bank was busy, filled with the chatter of customers, the soft clinking of coins, and the constant shuffling of paperwork. It was a Friday, which meant the lines were longer than usual. People were eager to finish their banking before the weekend. Behind the polished counters stood Clara, a young bank teller in her mid-20s. She had been working at the bank for almost a year, but still, she hadn't grown used to the endless stream of faces and demands. Her smile, once fresh and welcoming when she had first started, had grown faint over the months. Today, she wasn't, even trying to hide her impatience. The clock on the wall showed 10:30 a.m., but to Clara, it felt like the day had already dragged on for hours. She tapped her pen against the counter as the woman in front of her counted her coins one by one, carefully arranging them on the desk. Clara forced herself not to sigh out loud, but her thoughts were restless. Why can't people be quicker? Why do they always waste time over the smallest things? Finally, the woman collected her receipt and walked away, leaving Clara with a small sense of relief. She adjusted her neat uniform, ran her fingers over her brown ponytail, and called out, "Next, please!" From the line, an elderly man stepped forward. He walked slowly, leaning heavily on his wooden cane. His clothes were clean but worn, his shirt collar a little frayed, and his shoes looked older than most of the people in line. He held a small slip of paper in his hand, folded and creased from being gripped too tightly. His steps were unsteady, and as he reached the counter, he gave Clara a polite nod. "Good morning, miss," he said in a voice that trembled slightly with age. Clara's eyes darted to the slip he was holding. She reached for it quickly, eager to get this over with. The paper was a withdrawal slip, but the handwriting was shaky, uneven, and smudged. The numbers were not written clearly. It said he wanted to withdraw $100, but the words and digits looked uncertain, as though he wasn't sure of his own writing. Clara pursed her lips. She felt irritation rise within her. "Sir, this isn't filled out properly," she said, her tone sharper than she intended. "You need to write, clearly. I can't process this the way it is." The old man blinked, confused. His eyes were pale blue, filled with both kindness and sadness, as though he had seen more years than he could carry. I tried," he whispered. His hands shook as he held on to the counter for support. "My eyesight, it isn't what it used to be, but it should say $100. Just 100, please." Clara tapped the slip with her pen, her frustration spilling over. "That's not the point. You have to fill it out properly or else it causes delays. You should know how to do this by now." Her words carried across the quiet room, and a few customers in line glanced up from their phones and papers. The old man's cheeks flushed red, and he lowered his head as if ashamed of his own weakness. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood there, silent, holding on to the cane in one hand and the counter in the other. Clara crossed her arms, waiting for him to respond. She was annoyed, but also restless. She had other customers to attend to, and she didn't like wasting time. Inside her mind, she told herself she was only doing her job. Rules were rules. If slips weren't filled out correctly, it could lead to mistakes. Still, her tone carried little compassion, and she knew it. The line grew longer. Behind the man, someone coughed impatiently. Clara could feel the weight of many eyes on her, but instead of softening her approach, she doubled down. "Sir, you'll have to step aside and redo this properly," she said firmly. "We can't hold up the entire line for this." The old man looked down at the paper, then at his trembling hand. For a moment, it seemed as though he might try to rewrite it right there on the counter. His hand hovered in the air, clutching the pen Clara had reluctantly offered. But the tremor was too strong, and he hesitated, his fingers trembling so much that the pen nearly slipped. His shoulders slumped in quiet defeat. The bank felt suddenly heavy with silence. Even the clicking of keyboards and the ringing of phones seemed to fade for a moment. The customers behind him exchanged uncertain glances. A mother held her child a little closer. A businessman frowned, shifting uncomfortably as he checked his watch. Everyone could see the struggle unfolding, but no one spoke. Clara's jaw tightened. Deep down, a small voice inside her whispered that she might be going too far. That maybe she should help him instead of making him feel small. But she ignored the voice. She was tired. She was stressed. And most of all, she was impatient. So, she did something she would later regret. She let out a short, sharp scoff, a sound that was unmistakable in its meaning. The old man froze. His face turned pale and his eyes glistened as if he was holding back tears. For a second, he looked like a child scolded unfairly, though he was clearly a man who had seen many decades of life. And that was the exact moment Clara felt something shift in the room. The customers behind the man had fallen unusually silent. The air seemed to grow tense, expectant, as though everyone was waiting for something to happen. Clara glanced up, and that was when she saw him. A tall figure standing directly behind the old man in line. His presence was quiet but commanding, his expression unreadable yet piercing. It took Clara a second to recognize the face she had seen many times in newspapers and on television. It was Governor Matthews, and he had witnessed everything. The silence inside the bank stretched longer than anyone expected. Clara's sharp scoff had cut through the air, leaving an invisible mark that could not be ignored. The elderly man shifted uneasily, gripping his cane tighter as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. His lips trembled, but no words came out. The withdrawal slip still lay between him and Clara, a simple piece of paper that had now become a source of shame. Clara's heartbeat quickened. Something felt wrong, but she could not place it immediately. It was the weight in the room. The way every eye seemed to be staring at her, the way even the air felt heavier. And then her gaze rose to the tall figure directly behind the old man, Governor Matthews. She had seen his face on television more than once, giving speeches about honesty, kindness, and the importance of community. She had seen his smile in newspapers, standing beside school children and elderly citizens during charity drives. And now, impossibly, he was standing here, in her line, watching her interaction with the old man. Clara's throat went dry. The governor's eyes were steady, calm, yet piercing. He didn't say a word, but his silence carried more weight than any scolding ever could. Clara quickly looked down at her desk, hoping to escape his gaze, but the damage was done. The customers behind him had noticed too. A soft murmur rippled through the line, though no one dared to speak loudly. The old man, unaware at first of who stood behind him, turned slightly to glance back. When his eyes landed on the governor, a spark of recognition lit his weary face. "Oh," he whispered, his voice faint but warm. "Matthew, my boy." The governor's expression softened instantly. He stepped closer and gently placed a hand on the old man's shoulder. "It's good to see you, James," he said in a low, respectful tone. "How have you been holding up?" A few gasps escaped from the line of customers. Clara's head snapped upward, her eyes wide with shock. "James?" she thought. "The governor knows him?" The old man smiled faintly, though his eyes still carried sadness. "I get by," he replied, "though these hands aren't what they used to be. Writing even a simple slip has become difficult." His gaze flickered to Clara, then back to the governor, as though embarrassed by what had just unfolded. "Governor," Matthews gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "You've done enough in your life, James. You don't have to prove anything to anyone anymore." The words were simple, but they carried a tenderness that made Clara's stomach twist with guilt. She had treated this man like an inconvenience, but the governor spoke to him like he was someone valuable, someone important. And suddenly Clara realized she had no idea who this man really was. The customers in line leaned forward, eager to catch every word. The room, once filled with chatter and movement, was now silent except for the soft hum of the overhead lights. The old man, James, lowered his head again, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. Clara swallowed hard, trying to find her voice. "Sir," she began, her tone suddenly gentler, "if you'd like, I can help fill this out for you. It won't take long." But her attempt at kindness came too late. The customers had already seen her irritation, her impatience, and her scoff. She could feel their judgment pressing down on her from all directions. Governor Matthews glanced at her, his eyes still calm but thoughtful. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't scold her in public. But the disappointment in his gaze was more powerful than any sharp word could have been. Clara felt her cheeks flush, heat crawling up her neck. James gave a small shake of his head. "It's all right, young lady," he said softly. "I didn't mean to trouble anyone. I just needed a little money for the week." His voice cracked at the end, and the sound pierced Clara's heart like a quiet blade. For the first time that morning, she truly saw him. Not as a burden, not as a delay in the line, but as a human being carrying years of struggle. The lines on his face told stories she had never bothered to imagine. The tremor in his hands was not laziness or carelessness, but the weight of time itself. Governor Matthews leaned slightly closer to James. "Come, let's finish this together," he said gently. Then he looked at Clara again, his tone polite, but steady. "May we?" Clara quickly nodded, her voice caught in her throat. "Of course, sir." She watched in silence as the governor guided James to the side counter where forms were kept. He picked up a pen, steady and confident, and began filling out the slip on James's behalf, asking him each detail with patience and care. 100, correct? He asked softly. James nodded, smiling faintly at the kindness. The sight stirred something deep within the watching crowd. A young mother whispered to her child, "See? Always be kind." A businessman lowered his phone, his expression thoughtful. Even the security guard by the door stood straighter, as though humbled by what he was witnessing. Clara's chest tightened. Shame washed over her, stronger with every passing second. She thought of her own grandfather, who used to struggle with writing checks before he passed away. She remembered how frustrated she would feel as a teenager watching him fumble with paperwork. But never, never had she treated him with open irritation. So why had she done it to this man? When the governor and James returned to her counter, the slip was neat, clear, and ready. Clara's hands shook slightly as she took it, processing the withdrawal with more care than she had shown any customer that day. She counted the bills twice before sliding them across the counter. James accepted them with a polite nod. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Clara wanted to apologize right then, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she forced a small smile and said, "Have a good day, sir." It felt weak, empty, compared to what she wanted to express. Governor Matthews gave her one last look before guiding James toward the exit. That look wasn't angry. It wasn't cruel. But it held a quiet lesson, a reminder of dignity, respect, and the weight of every choice we make when dealing with others. The bank slowly returned to its rhythm, but Clara couldn't shake the heavy silence in her chest. The sound of her own scoff replayed in her mind, each echo louder than the last. She knew this was only the beginning of a lesson she would never forget. The heavy glass doors of the bank closed behind James and Governor Matthews as they walked out into the sunlight. Yet inside, the atmosphere remained unsettled. Customers returned to their tasks, but a trace of tension still lingered in the air, like a shadow that refused to fade. Clara sat behind her counter, her fingers frozen on the keyboard. The withdrawal transaction had been simple, yet it left her shaken. She tried to steady her breathing, but the image of Governor Matthews' eyes lingered in her mind, calm, steady, but deeply disappointed. She had faced angry customers before. She had even been scolded by her manager once or twice. But this was different. The governor had not shouted, nor had he embarrassed her in front of the crowd. Instead, he had simply looked at her. That silent gaze carried a weight stronger than words, a reminder that she had failed at something more important than just her job. It wasn't about paperwork. It wasn't about rules. It was about respect. Clara tried to brush it off. She forced herself to smile at the next customer, a woman depositing a paycheck. "Good morning," she said, her tone brighter than before. But the woman only gave her a polite nod, her eyes still clouded with judgment from what she had witnessed earlier. Clara felt a sting in her chest. They all saw it, she thought. They saw me belittle him, and now they'll remember it. Her shift dragged on, each transaction blurring into the next. Numbers, signatures, slips, coins. Yet no matter how much she tried to focus on the routine, her mind wandered back to James. The way his hand trembled when he held the pen, the way his eyes had glistened when she scoffed at him, and then, always, the governor's gaze, heavy, with unspoken truth. At noon, Clara stepped away for her lunch break. She carried her sandwich to the small break room, but her appetite was gone. She unwrapped it slowly, staring at the bread as though it held answers. The voices of her co-workers drifted around her. Some talked about their weekend plans, others about errands, but she couldn't join in. She felt like a shadow among them, heavy with guilt. Finally, she whispered to herself, "Why did I do that?" The question echoed in her mind. She wasn't a cruel person. At least she had never thought of herself that way. But the truth was harder to swallow. She had been careless. She had let her impatience speak louder than her kindness. Her thoughts returned to her grandfather again. He had been gentle, patient, always telling her stories about his youth. Toward the end of his life, his hands had also trembled. Sometimes he had trouble remembering names. Clara remembered the way she used to guide his hand when he wrote checks, steadying his pen with her own. She hadn't minded then. She had been kind. So why had she treated James differently? The answer was painful. Because he was a stranger. And because she thought no one important was watching. Her chest tightened as she realized the truth. She hadn't just disrespected James. She had revealed a weakness in herself. The rest of the day passed slowly, and when the bank finally closed at 4 p.m., Clara felt drained. She gathered her things and stepped outside, the cool breeze brushing against her face. She thought about heading straight home, burying herself in a book or television to forget the day. But her steps slowed as she reached the sidewalk. Across the street, a small group of people had gathered near the town square. From where she stood, Clara could see a familiar figure speaking to them. Her breath caught. It was Governor Matthews. Her first instinct was to turn away, to avoid him at all costs. But something inside her urged her to stop. Perhaps it was guilt. Perhaps it was shame. Or maybe it was the faint hope that she could somehow make things right. She crossed the street slowly, blending into the small crowd. The governor was addressing the townspeople, his voice calm, yet filled with conviction. Respect is not measured by wealth, status, or power, he was saying. Respect is something every person deserves, no matter their background, no matter their struggles. A community thrives not when we honor only those in high positions, but when we honor each other, equally, humbly, and with compassion. Clara's heart pounded. His words pierced her like arrows. It was as if he were speaking directly to her, though his eyes never once landed on her face. James stood beside him, leaning on his cane, listening quietly. He didn't seem angry or bitter. If anything, his expression was one of peace, though. A hint of weariness remained in his eyes. Clara felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She wanted to run forward, to apologize, to explain herself, but fear held her in place. What if he rejected her apology? What if he told her it was too late? As the governor finished his short speech, the crowd applauded softly. Some people approached, him to shake his hand, others to greet James with smiles and kind words. Clara stood frozen at the edge, unsure if she belonged there. Then, for a brief moment, the governor's eyes swept across the crowd. They landed on Clara. His gaze held steady, silent yet powerful. It wasn't angry. It wasn't cruel. But it was a reminder, the same reminder she had felt inside the bank. That silent gaze seemed to say, "You know what you must do." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She lowered her eyes, unable to meet his for long, but in that brief exchange, something inside her shifted. She knew she could not run from this mistake. She would have to face it, admit it, and learn from it. The governor turned away, continuing to greet the townspeople. James gave a small wave to the crowd before the two men began walking toward a nearby car. Clara stood there, her heart aching, with a strange mix of regret and determination. The silent gaze had spoken louder than words, and Clara knew her journey toward redemption had only just begun. The next morning, Clara arrived at the bank earlier than usual. The sun had barely risen, spilling soft, golden light across the quiet streets of Willow Creek. Inside the bank, the atmosphere was calm, almost peaceful, a sharp contrast to the chaos of yesterday. But Clara's mind was far from calm. Her thoughts were consumed by James and the governor. She could still feel the weight of their presence, the silent lesson left behind by the governor's gaze. She tried to focus on her routine, straightening paperwork and organizing forms, but every sound seemed to remind her of what had happened: the rustling of slips, the clicking of pens, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. All echoed the memory of her impatience and her scorn. A few minutes later, the doors opened, and James walked in, leaning carefully on his cane. His presence was quiet, yet dignified. Clara froze for a moment, unsure how to act. "Good morning, sir," she said softly, forcing a polite smile. James nodded, returning her greeting. His eyes, though tired, carried warmth and recognition. "Good morning, Clara," he said gently. "I hope I'm not disturbing you too early." "No, sir," she replied quickly. "It's fine. How are you today?" He hesitated, glancing around the bank. Then, as if deciding something, he leaned closer and spoke in a quiet voice. "I came to say thank you for yesterday." Clara blinked, confused. "Thank me? But I was rude to you." Her cheeks burned at the memory of her scoff, the sharp words, the irritation she had shown. James shook his head slowly. "Yes, you were impatient, but you didn't know my story, and sometimes the lessons we learn come from our mistakes." His smile was faint but genuine, and Clara felt a strange warmth spread in her chest. At that moment, Governor Matthews appeared in the doorway. He was dressed simply, as he often was when visiting his hometown, but his presence commanded attention nonetheless. Clara's heart skipped a beat. The governor's eyes swept the room, and then they landed on James and her. "Good morning, Clara," he said calmly, his voice even and kind. "I trust everything is in order today?" "Yes, sir," Clara replied, her voice shaking slightly. "The governor nodded, turning his attention to James. "And how are you, James?" "I'm doing well, thank you." James answered. "I came to the bank today to make a few arrangements and to visit with Clara a little. I think she learned something yesterday, don't you think?" Clara's face turned crimson. She wanted to protest, to deny it, but she felt the truth deep in her heart. She had learned something. She had learned humility. She had learned patience. And perhaps most importantly, she had learned respect. The governor smiled faintly. "I'm glad to see that." He stepped closer to Clara, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "James has taught many people in his life. Even I owe him a great deal. But respect, true respect, is something we must learn every day, in every interaction. You showed that you are willing to learn, and that is the first step." Clara's throat tightened. She nodded, unable to speak at first. The governor's words were gentle, yet they cut deeper than any criticism she had ever received. James then took a small seat at one of the empty chairs in the waiting area. "You know, Clara," he said, his voice kind and steady, "I have spent many years teaching children. And sometimes, the most important lessons are not in books or numbers, but in how we treat others. Yesterday, I saw a young person rush through life without seeing the heart behind the face. But I also saw someone who could change. That is a gift. And I wanted to show you that." Clara felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She wanted to apologize again, to say all the words she had failed to speak yesterday. But instead, she simply nodded, feeling the weight of the bond forming in the quiet room. Governor Matthews watched the exchange silently, a soft smile on his face. Then he spoke, addressing both Clara and James. "Life is full of moments like this," he said. "Moments where we are given a chance to see someone differently, to understand them, and to act with kindness. Cherish these moments, for they define who we are." James looked up at the governor with a small grin. "I'm grateful you are here, Matthew. It gives weight to what I'm trying to teach." The governor nodded, his eyes twinkling slightly. "And I am grateful for your wisdom, James. It is rare to meet someone whose life is a lesson in itself." Clara's heart swelled. She had never felt such a mix of awe and gratitude in her life. The lesson she had been given was clear. Respect was more than a polite word or a simple gesture. It was understanding, patience, and recognizing the worth in every person, regardless of age, status, or appearance. As the morning wore on, James completed his banking tasks with Clara's careful assistance. They spoke quietly about everyday matters, the weather, small-town news, and memories from Willow Creek's past. Each word, each smile, each shared glance deepened the bond forming between them. By the time James and the governor prepared to leave, Clara felt a profound shift within herself. She had begun to see her work, her customers, and herself in a new light. Each person who came to the bank was more than a transaction. They were a story, a life, a lesson waiting to be understood. James gave Clara a warm smile as he stood with the governor at the door. "Thank you, Clara, for listening, for learning, and for treating me with patience today. It means more than you will ever know." Clara's voice finally found strength. "Thank you, sir, for teaching me." The governor added quietly, "Remember, Clara, the bond we form with others is built on respect, understanding, and care. Never forget that." As they stepped outside into the bright sunlight, Clara remained inside, watching them leave. Her heart felt lighter, yet full in a way she could not describe. She realized that life would continue to test her patience and compassion, but she now had a deeper understanding of how to respond. For the first time in a long while, she felt hope, not just for herself, but for the people she would serve every day. She had witnessed an unexpected bond forming between a young teller, an old teacher, and the governor. That bond was quiet, subtle, and powerful. It had taught her something she would never forget. And Clara knew that tomorrow, when another customer came to her counter, she would carry this lesson with her, letting kindness, respect, and understanding guide her actions. The afternoon sun poured into the bank through the wide glass windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors. Clara sat behind her counter, still processing deposits and withdrawals, but her mind was far from the routine. She kept thinking about James and the governor, about the lessons of respect, patience, and kindness that had unfolded before her eyes over the past 2 days. She hadn't expected James to return this morning. He had completed his withdrawal and small tasks yesterday, and yet here he was again, quietly walking toward her counter with the same gentle smile. His cane clicked softly against the floor, and for a moment, Clara forgot to breathe. "Good afternoon, Clara," James said warmly. "I hope I'm not troubling you again?" "No, sir," Clara replied, her voice quieter than usual. It's fine. How can I help you today?" James placed a small folder on the counter carefully, opening it to reveal a few old documents. "I came today to show you something," he said. His hands shook slightly, though his eyes held a spark of purpose. "Something I've kept for a long time." Clara leaned in, curious. "What is it, sir?" He smiled faintly. "It's my story, and it's a story that even I didn't fully realize the importance of until now." As James began to speak, he told her about his life. He had been a school teacher for over 40 years in Willow Creek, educating generations of children. Many of those children had gone on to achieve great things, including some who had become leaders in the state. But Clara listened closely when he spoke about one student in particular, a young boy who had struggled in school, who had often been overlooked, but who had shown determination and courage. That boy, James said quietly, was Matthew. He looked toward the door as though ensuring the governor wasn't around to overhear, then back at Clara. "Governor Matthews. He has been a good man, a strong leader, but none of that would have been possible without guidance, patience, and encouragement during his youth. I was there in a small classroom helping him when no one else did." Clara's eyes widened. She hadn't realized that the elderly man she had scolded was not only a teacher, but someone whose influence shaped the very people who shaped the state. The weight of that revelation settled on her like a heavy cloak. She felt a mixture of awe and shame, knowing she had misjudged him so easily. James continued, speaking of the quiet struggles he had faced over the years. How he had worked long hours, how he had seen children succeed and fail, how he had never expected recognition or praise. "I didn't teach for reward," he said softly. "I taught because it was the right thing to do, because someone had to care, someone had to guide. That's the work that matters." Clara felt tears welling up in her eyes. She wanted to reach out, to apologize again, but words felt insufficient. She realized that for years she had been focused on efficiency, rules, and appearances, often forgetting that every person who came through her counter had a story she could not see at first glance. Then James reached into the folder again, pulling out an old photograph. It was a picture of a young boy, smiling shyly, holding a small certificate. "That boy became the governor," James said, his voice steady, yet filled with quiet pride. And even as he rose to leadership, he never forgot the lessons of patience, respect, and humility he learned in my classroom. That's why he stood behind me yesterday, quietly watching, not to shame you, but to remind all of us, of what truly matters. Clara's lips trembled as she absorbed the truth. The old man she had dismissed in seconds had shaped the life of one of the most respected leaders in the state. She had been harsh, impatient, and unkind, and now she understood the depth of her error. James looked at her gently. "Clara, I do not hold anger against you. What happened yesterday was a moment, a learning moment. You see now what it means to treat every person with dignity, regardless of appearances, age, or status. That is the most important lesson I can teach. Clara nodded, tears spilling over. I understand now, sir. I am so sorry for how I acted. I will never forget this lesson. James smiled, placing a comforting hand over hers for a brief moment. It is enough that you recognize it and choose to act differently in the future. That is all any of us can do. Learn, change, and try to be better every day. At that moment, Governor Matthews entered the bank. He had returned quietly, unannounced, but with the same calm authority he always carried. His eyes scanned the room, landing on Clara and James. A soft smile appeared on his face as he approached. "Clara," he said, his voice gentle, "I wanted to return to see if everything was all right. And I see it is, thanks to James." He turned to James, nodding with respect. "Your dedication, your patience, and your wisdom continue to inspire. You have touched lives in ways people may never fully realize." James inclined his head humbly. "Thank you, Matthew. But we both know it is not about recognition. It is about the work and the people who benefit from it." Clara watched this exchange, feeling a profound shift within herself. The bond between James and the governor, built over decades of patience and understanding, had left its mark on her. She realized that respect and kindness were not just words. They were actions, daily choices, and quiet lessons that shaped lives in ways she could never have imagined. Governor Matthews turned to Clara, his gaze warm but serious. "Every encounter you have is an opportunity," he said. "An opportunity to show respect, to understand, to be compassionate. Yesterday was one of those moments, and today you've seen the impact of such lessons. Carry it with you, always." Clara nodded, her voice finally steady. "I will, sir. Thank you for showing me what really matters." As the governor and James prepared to leave once more, Clara felt an unspoken promise forming within her heart. She would never again underestimate a person's worth. She would treat every customer with patience and kindness, remembering the story she had learned about a teacher, a governor, and the quiet, transformative power of respect. As they walked out together, James leaning slightly on his cane and Governor Matthews beside him, Clara felt a new sense of purpose. She had witnessed not only a revelation about James's life, but also a revelation about herself. She had been reminded that every person carries a story, every action matters, and every moment holds the potential to teach or to harm. Clara sat back at her desk, taking a deep breath. The afternoon light fell across her counter, and for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to meet the world differently, patiently, kindly, and with a new understanding of the power of respect. The next day, the bank seemed calmer than usual, though Clara could feel the weight of yesterday's lessons lingering in the air. She arrived early, carrying her bag and a small notebook she had started keeping, filled with personal reflections. Every morning she spent a few minutes reading her notes, reminding herself why respect and patience mattered, and how quickly they could be lost if she allowed impatience or judgment to take over. As Clara organized forms and stamped documents, she noticed a small crowd forming at the entrance. Curious, she glanced up and recognized a few regular customers, each waiting patiently. Among them was a young woman with a child, a businessman she knew from town, and a few elderly residents. Clara realized she had a new awareness, one she hadn't felt before. These people weren't just transactions. Each carried their own life, their own challenges, and their own dignity. She could see it now in their eyes, even when they simply smiled politely. The door opened, and to her surprise, James entered, once again. He moved slowly, leaning on his cane, but there was a light in his eyes that made him seem almost youthful. Behind him, the governor quietly followed. Clara felt her heart tighten, not from fear, but from a deep sense of anticipation. She knew that today's lesson was not only for her, but for everyone present. "Good morning, Clara," James said warmly. "I hope I'm not disturbing you again." Clara shook her head, a small smile forming. "No, sir. It's fine. It's an honor to see you again." James's eyes twinkled. "You've been reflecting on our last meeting, haven't you?" Clara nodded. "Yes, sir. I've realized so much about patience, respect, and understanding. I want to do better." The governor stepped forward, his voice calm but commanding. "Clara, the lessons we learn from others shape us more than we often realize. Yesterday, you saw the outcome of a single moment, how respect, or the lack of it, can affect someone's dignity. Today, I want to show you why it matters in a larger sense." He gestured to the small crowd who watched silently. "Every person you serve, every interaction you have, leaves an impression. Some may never remember your name, but they will remember how you made them feel. That memory can shape their day, their life, or even the decisions they make in the future." Clara listened intently, hanging on every word. Her hands rested lightly on the counter, but her mind was fully engaged. She realized that respect wasn't something she could practice only when she felt patient. It was a daily responsibility, requiring awareness and empathy in every encounter. James leaned slightly on his cane, addressing the crowd. "When I was teaching, I often encountered students who were overlooked or underestimated. One of them, Matthew, who is now the governor, was one such child. He wasn't perfect, and he faced struggles that many didn't see. But by showing patience, understanding, and respect, we helped him grow into the person he is today. And that same principle applies everywhere, in schools, at work, and even here, at this bank." Clara felt tears forming, but she held them back, aware of the dignity of the moment. She had seen this lesson in action firsthand, and now she understood it more deeply than words could convey. Governor Matthews added, "Respect is not given because someone demands it, nor is it earned solely through accomplishments. Respect is a recognition of another human being's worth. It is consistent, fair, and quiet. It does not require applause. It requires thoughtfulness and care." The customers in the bank watched closely, many nodding subtly. Some exchanged looks, realizing that this simple lesson applied to them as well. Clara noticed the young mother smiling at her child, perhaps already thinking about teaching them the same value. Even the businessman appeared contemplative, understanding that small gestures of kindness could have a ripple effect. James turned to Clara directly. "Yesterday, you scoffed at me. It hurt, yes, but more importantly, it reminded you of something crucial. You have the power to lift people up or make them feel small in the blink of an eye. That choice is yours every day. And when you choose respect, you honor not only the other person, but yourself." Clara's voice quivered as she replied, "I understand now, sir. I see that respect is more than just manners. It's about seeing the person, their story, and their struggles. I won't forget this lesson." The governor placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "Remember, Clara, it isn't about perfection. It's about effort, awareness, and intent. Mistakes will happen, but each one is an opportunity to grow, to do better, and to impact others positively. This is the true lesson in respect." James smiled, then looked at the small crowd, his eyes kind. "Let us all remember that we meet people every day who deserve patience, understanding, and dignity. Whether in a bank, a school, or anywhere in life, respect should never be overlooked. Each person's story matters, even if we do not know it fully." Clara felt a warmth spread through her chest. It was as if a weight had been lifted, replaced by clarity and purpose. She could see the bond forming between the customers, James and the governor, a quiet but powerful understanding that respect was not optional but essential. As James and the governor prepared to leave, Clara walked them to the door, her steps steady and confident. "Thank you, sir," she said to James. "And thank you, Governor. I will carry this lesson with me every day." James nodded, his smile gentle. "And I believe you will. Remember, Clara, it is the small, consistent actions of respect that create a meaningful life." The governor added, "And when you teach others this even without speaking, you extend the lesson further than you can imagine." As the two men stepped outside, Clara stood by the window, watching them walk down the street. The sun glinted off their backs, casting long shadows that stretched across the sidewalk. She felt a sense of purpose unlike anything she had experienced before. She returned to her desk with a newfound determination. The lesson in respect was no longer theoretical. It was real, lived, and demonstrated before her eyes. She knew that her role at the bank, though small in the grand scheme of life, carried significance. Every customer interaction was an opportunity to practice respect, to recognize humanity, and to make a difference. Clara sat down, straightened the papers before her, and waited for the next customer. She was ready, not just to process a transaction, but to honor the story behind each person who came through her doors. And as she smiled warmly at the first customer of the afternoon, she felt a quiet certainty. This was only the beginning of her journey, but it was a beginning grounded in understanding, patience, and the enduring power of respect. The morning sun spilled gently across the polished floors of the bank, casting warm patterns through the wide glass windows. Clara arrived earlier than usual, feeling a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. Today, she wasn't just another teller behind the counter. Today felt different. Yesterday's lessons had settled deep in her heart, and she could feel the weight of responsibility that came with them. As she arranged the slips and stamped forms, she reflected on the past week. From the initial impatience that led her to scoff at James, to witnessing the silent power of the governor's gaze, and finally understanding the depth of James's life story, every moment had reshaped her. She knew now that her actions, even small ones, could lift someone's spirit or diminish it. Respect, kindness, and patience were not optional. They were essential. The doors of the bank opened, and in walked James, leaning carefully on his cane. Behind him, though unobtrusive, was Governor Matthews. Clara's heart skipped a beat. She took a deep breath, centering herself, and prepared for what felt like a culmination of all the lessons she had learned. "Good morning, Clara," James greeted warmly, his eyes carrying a gentle wisdom. "I hope I'm not interrupting your work." "No, sir," Clara replied, her voice steady and polite. "It's an honor to see you again." The governor nodded at her, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Clara, it is good to see you. Today will be another important moment, one that allows action to follow understanding." James carefully approached the counter, holding a folded piece of paper. Clara recognized it immediately. Another withdrawal slip. But there was something different this time. James's hand shook slightly, but his eyes carried calmness and quiet dignity. Clara extended her hand to take the slip. "I'll help you with that, sir," she said softly, meeting his gaze with sincerity. James nodded, placing the paper gently on the counter. "Thank you, Clara. I trust you now, more than yesterday." His words made Clara's chest tighten with both pride and humility. As she began to process the withdrawal, she spoke softly, ensuring every step was calm and attentive. $100, correct, sir?" she asked. "Yes," James replied, a small smile forming on his face. "And I want to thank you again for your patience yesterday. I know it wasn't easy." Clara shook her head. "No, sir. It was easy once I understood. You've taught me so much about respect and kindness." The governor watched the exchange silently, his presence calm yet commanding. Clara could feel the weight of his attention, but it wasn't judgmental. It was supportive, encouraging her growth. As Clara counted the bills, she felt a profound sense of purpose. This was no longer just a routine transaction. It was an opportunity to put into practice every lesson she had learned over the past few days. She slid the money across the counter with care, making sure her movements were deliberate, respectful, and calm. James accepted it with a gracious nod. "Thank you, Clara. I feel seen and respected, and that means more than the money itself." Clara's eyes glistened with tears. She realized in that moment that respect could be as simple as a smile, a gentle tone, or careful attention. It wasn't about titles, rules, or efficiency. It was about recognizing the human being in front of her. The customers in the bank had grown quiet, watching the interaction unfold. Some of them nodded subtly, as if reminded of lessons they had forgotten. The young mother with her child whispered softly, "See? That's how everyone deserves to be treated." The businessman lowered his phone, reflecting on his own actions. Even the security guard seemed softer, more aware. James leaned slightly on his cane and spoke, his voice gentle. "Clara, what you've done today is more than processing a withdrawal. You've shown me dignity, and you've demonstrated that you understand the value of respect in every interaction. That is something rare and beautiful." Clara felt her throat tighten. She wanted to tell him how much his words meant, but instead she simply nodded, letting the gratitude shine through her expression. Governor Matthews stepped forward, addressing Clara quietly but firmly. "Clara, this is the true measure of growth. Lessons learned are not fully realized until they are acted upon. You have acted with patience, care, and understanding. That is the mark of true character." The governor's words filled Clara with a sense of accomplishment, not of pride, but of deep satisfaction. She had stumbled, made a mistake, and been given the chance to correct it. And now, through her actions, she had redeemed herself, not for applause, but because it was the right thing to do. James folded the withdrawal slip and placed it gently in his pocket. "I am grateful, Clara. You have learned well, and your heart shows it." Clara's voice was steady now, filled with quiet confidence. "Thank you, sir. You and Governor Matthews have shown me the power of respect. I will carry this lesson with me every day, for every person who comes through this door." The governor smiled. "That is all anyone can ask of you. Respect is contagious. By showing it, you inspire others to show it as well. That ripple can change lives, including your own." James gave Clara a warm, final smile, then turned to leave with the governor. "Farewell, Clara. Continue to do good in the small ways. They matter more than you know." Clara watched them walk out into the sunlight, their shadows stretching long across the street. She felt a mixture of relief, joy, and determination. The lesson she had learned, the importance of respect, patience, and understanding, was no longer abstract. It was lived, felt, and proven in action. The bank doors closed behind them, leaving Clara alone at her counter. She took a deep breath, her hands steady, her mind clear. Another customer approached, a small slip of paper in hand, and Clara greeted them warmly. "Good morning," she said, her voice calm and full of sincerity. As she assisted the customer, she remembered every lesson James and the governor had taught her. She spoke with kindness, listened patiently, and treated the person before her as someone whose life mattered, even if she didn't know their story. And in that moment, Clara knew something important. Redemption was not a one-time event. It was a choice, made again and again in every action and word. By choosing respect, she had transformed not only her own perspective, but also the experience of every person who came through the bank's doors. Clara smiled softly, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. She realized that while James and the governor had guided her, the true change had come from within. She had learned to see others, to honor their stories, and to act with kindness in every moment. As the day continued, customers came and went, but Clara remained grounded, patient, and fully present. Each transaction, each conversation became an opportunity to practice what she had learned. And every time she looked up and met someone's eyes, she remembered the lessons of patience, humility, and the quiet power of respect. By the end of the day, Clara felt lighter, freer, and more connected to the world around her. She had redeemed herself, not for recognition, not for praise, but because she had chosen the right way to act. And she knew that this choice, made each day, would continue to shape her life and the lives of others in ways she might never fully understand. The sun set over Willow Creek, casting a golden glow through the windows of the bank. Clara straightened. Her desk, took a deep breath, and prepared to leave for the day, carrying with her a heart full of wisdom, humility, and the enduring lesson that respect is the greatest gift we can give and receive.